If you've ever thought an old man who fixes ships, reads comics, and sips sidewalk coffee couldn't possibly become the most wanted man in the galaxy, then you haven't met Kale Virell. And if you believe love between a grizzled mechanic and an alien warrior princess existed only in satire, well, buckle up. The Gamma Verge station was the kind of place where empires whispered, smugglers thrived, and the air always smelled faintly of fried algae and ambition. Kale Virell fit right in. With a half-zip flight jacket stained by 3 different engine oils, a weathered white beard, and a hollow comic hovering above his wrist, he looked more like a cranky retired spacer than someone who would shift the trajectory of interstellar politics. At that moment, Kale was lounging at a rust-colored table in a market quadrant known affectionately as Rust Ring. He cradled a steaming cup of synth coffee and chuckled hoarsely at a panel in his favorite Caldwell Adventures issue. A green-skinned vendor across the street eyed him with a mix of confusion and caution, perhaps wondering how someone that wrinkled could be so amused by fictional space hijinks while chaos brewed on the edges of the station. Then the drums started. Not the usual synthetic beats from nearby clubs. No, these were ceremonial, deep, pulsing, rhythmic, echoing across the corridors like the heartbeat of some ancient beast awakening. The crowd instinctively parted, as if summoned by tradition older than any of them remembered. And in the center of that living corridor strode Selira Thorne. She was a vision pulled from 1,000 legends, 6 feet of poise, clad in ceremonial armor that shimmered with violet and silver hues. Her eyes, glowing with a cold azure fire, scanned the surroundings until they locked onto Kale, the only one not retreating, or bowing, or gasping. He just looked up from his comic, one gray eyebrow arched. "You," she said, her voice resonant, perfectly pitched. "You laughed during the summoning?" Kale blinked. "I laughed because the guy in my comic just activated a toilet that creates time paradoxes." There was a moment of confused silence. "The challenge has been answered," a booming voice declared, projected from a hovering ceremonial drone. "Wait, what?" No. "I wasn't answering anything," Kale said, waving his coffee cup as if it could dispel the misunderstanding. But the crowd roared, the arena lit up, and security drones surrounded him before he could bolt. Moments later, he was standing in the center of a combat ring that had risen from the floor, ancient, circular, marked with glowing glyphs. Opposite him stood Selira, now unhelmeted, her long, white blonde hair flowing down her back like a war banner. Her expression was unreadable. "This is a mistake," Kale said, holding up both hands, joints cracking slightly. "I am Selira Thorne, commander of the Virellian Vanguard. By right of the Luminous Accord, I issue challenge. Do you accept?" "Absolutely not," Kale replied. The crowd gasped. "The Accord interprets resistance as consent," the drone intoned. "Of course it does," Kale muttered under his breath. What followed was perhaps the most bizarre duel in the history of Virellian tradition. Selira moved with the grace and precision of a born warrior, her twin energy blades slicing through the air in a lethal dance. Kale, still holding his cup of coffee and rubbing an old knee injury, mostly ducked, tripped, stumbled, and sidestepped. At one point, he accidentally activated a cleaning drone that sprayed foam across the arena floor, making it slippery. Another time, he tried to throw his empty cup away and hit a control panel instead, which sparked and fizzled ominously. The end came not with a decisive strike, but with absurdity. Kale slipped on the foam, flailed his arms, and slammed into Selira, who, caught off guard, lost her footing and fell. Her head struck the platform edge with a dull thud, her blades deactivating instantly. The arena fell silent. Kale lay sprawled on top of her, blinking. Sorry," he said. "Combat concluded," the drone announced. "Victor, Kale Virell." Selira's eyes opened wide. For a moment, Kale thought she might kill him anyway. Instead, she sat up slowly, her voice steady. By law and legacy, I submit to your will. My service is yours until the bond is broken by death or honor. Wait, what? Kale croaked. Before he could protest, the glyphs beneath him flared to life. A beam of pale light engulfed Kale. Pain surged up his spine, then was gone. When he looked down, he saw the mark glowing faintly through his shirt, a geometric pattern pulsing with alien energy. The arena erupted in cheers, half celebratory, half confused. Selira stood beside him now, hand over her chest, head bowed. You are now bound to me, Kale Virell. I serve, protect, and obey until the right is broken. Kale stared at her, then at the crowd, then at the comic still clutched in his hand. Yep, he muttered. Definitely not how I expected my Tuesday to go. Kale Virell had always considered himself an expert in escaping problems. He dodged debt collectors on 3 moons, rerouted power systems mid-explosion, and even once avoided a wedding proposal by crawling through a malfunctioning air duct. But this was something else entirely. The glowing pattern on his lower back had started to pulse intermittently. At first, it was just a faint itch. Then a warmth. Now it hummed like an old starship engine gearing up for FTL, and Kale was fairly certain that wasn't normal. He stood shirtless in the corner of his rented maintenance bay quarters, peering into a cracked mirror while poking at the mark with a wrench. This can't be healthy, he muttered. Behind him, Selira Thorne stood with military precision, arms crossed over her armor. It is the link. A sacred neural bond forged through honorable combat. It was an accident. Kale barked, spinning around and immediately regretting it as his hip gave a quiet pop. Intent is irrelevant, she replied calmly. The Accord recognizes only outcome. He sighed and sat down heavily on the bunk, the mattress creaking in protest. You can't possibly believe I'm some kind of galactic champion. I tripped on soap foam. Selira took a few steps forward. Her expression remained stoic, but her voice softened. I serve not because of your prowess, but because the right chose you. That, of course, was when the mark began to glow brightly and the room shifted. Not physically, but perceptually. Kale felt a strange pull in his mind, like someone had opened a hidden door in his thoughts. Memories surfaced, not his own. Battlefields under twin suns. Orders shouted in a strange yet familiar tongue. The taste of iron and ozone. Emotions surged: honor, duty, fear so strong they nearly overwhelmed him. Selira gasped, one hand clutching her head. The bond, it's stabilizing. Kale stood again, unsteady. Wait, you felt that too? She nodded, stunned. We are connected. Our neural patterns are synchronizing. Great, he said, grabbing his shirt. I always wanted to share brainwaves with a space knight. Outside their quarters, the station had become a hive of rumors. Word spread fast on Gamma Verge, and Ancient Bond Activated was the kind of headline that drew everyone from mystic monks to mercenary bloggers. Kale couldn't walk 10 meters without someone trying to interview him, challenge him, or sell him commemorative mugs. He ducked into a maintenance shaft just to breathe. Selira followed effortlessly, her armor somehow silent despite its bulk. They're treating me like some kind of chosen one, Kale muttered. I don't even believe in fate. Your skepticism is irrelevant. The galaxy responds to symbols. Right now, you are one. They found a quiet alcove overlooking the station's energy core, glowing softly like a sun trapped in metal. For a while, neither spoke. Then Kale glanced over. You always this calm about life-altering mystical obligations. No, she said quietly. Kale blinked. That was the first time her voice had cracked. Selira sat beside him, removing her gloves. Her fingers trembled slightly. I was trained to serve, to fight, to obey tradition. But this bond, it is not just ritual. It feels real. That scare you? Kale asked gently. She nodded once. Kale exhaled slowly. Yeah. Me too. There was a silence, filled only by the distant hum of fusion reactors and the heartbeat of something neither of them could quite define. Two souls, bound by accident, staring into the strange horizon of what came next. Kale reached into his jacket, pulled out his holocomic, and activated it with a sigh. Chapter 23. The Caldwell twins survive an energy storm by duct taping themselves to a psychic whale. Want to read with me? Selira blinked, then allowed the faintest smile to ghost across her face. Yes. I would like that. Somewhere, the bond pulsed again, not painfully this time, but gently. Like a shared heartbeat. Like a beginning. It didn't take long for the Virellian Empire to respond. Within hours of the bond's activation, encrypted transmissions rippled through deep space like thunder through silence. A priority directive from the High Command echoed across Imperial channels: retrieve Princess Selira. Terminate the anomaly. And so the hunt began. A bounty was set on Kale Virell's head, 1 billion credits, dead or alive. To most, it seemed ridiculous. Who would place such a fortune on an old mechanic? But within certain circles, those who understood what the bond meant, the price was all too justified. Ancient prophecies. Power shifts. Political embarrassment. And the possibility that an unknown old man now carried a link to royal command. The galaxy responded as it always did, with greed. Hunters stirred in the lawless fringes of the quarry expanse. Former warlords and retired generals dusted off armor and activated old contacts. Even the Syndicate of Silence, long disbanded, issued a rare communique: target acquired. Kale was unaware of all this at first. He was too busy being dragged by Selira through maintenance corridors and docking platforms, grumbling as his bad knee flared up. This is insane, he muttered, hopping over a collapsed crate. 1 billion credits? I'm not even worth that. In sarcasm. Selira didn't respond. Her focus was razor sharp. Behind them, the station had erupted into chaos. Not open fire yet, but eyes watched from every shadow. Drones paused mid-routine. Traders locked up stalls. Information brokers smiled too wide. Their salvation came in the form of a rust-colored cargo hauler that looked like it hadn't passed inspection in decades. The Rust Flower. A freighter older than Kale, with an AI older still. Are you serious? Kale said, staring at the ship's patched hull and mismatched engines. It flies, Selira said. Barely. They launched with seconds to spare. A sleek mercenary vessel entered orbit just as Rust Flower's thrusters groaned to life. Within moments, the stars stretched around them, and Gamma Verge faded into the dark. For several hours, they said nothing. The hum of the engines and the occasional beep from the ship's ancient console filled the silence. Eventually, Kale wandered into the cockpit, rubbing his temples. If I find out this thing leaks atmosphere while I sleep, I'm going to haunt you. Selira didn't answer right away. She was analyzing a tactical star map projected mid-air. Wait, Kale said, squinting. That sector bypass. Who taught you to fly through the scythe belt like that? That's suicide. She looked over, surprised. It's the fastest route. Yeah, and half those asteroid clusters are dormant hunter mines. Here. He adjusted the display with 2 fingers. Route along the magnetic drifts. It's slower, but it'll cloak our heat signatures. Selira studied him. You speak like someone trained in fleet tactics. I read a lot of comics, he said. Then added, more quietly, and I used to build battle simulators. For kids. And some militias. And maybe a few pirates. Later, as Kale explored the engine room, a voice echoed through the space-distorted, ancient. He froze. That's not possible. The ship's AI interface flickered to life. An orb of light hovered above the console. Selira entered just in time to see Kale interacting with the AI in a language she didn't recognize. It was guttural, full of staccato rhythm clearly older than standard galactic. What is that tongue? She asked. Old engineering dialect, Kale said, not turning around. Obsolete. Supposedly. Why do you speak it? He didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, he patted the console. Rust Flowers still got a few tricks left. For the first time, Selira looked at Kale not as a man who'd stumbled into fate but as a mystery. An anomaly. And perhaps, something more. That night, in the dim-lit commons of the Rust Flower, Kale stared out the viewport. Stars passed slowly, like distant lanterns in the void. I didn't ask for this, he said aloud. Selira stood nearby, arms at her side. Neither did I. He turned to her, exhaustion in his eyes but something else to resolve. Well, he said, raising his mug of ready-draft coffee, here's to getting hunted by the galaxy, bonded to a warrior princess, and flying a ship held together by luck and spite. Selira raised her own cup, expression unreadable. To the bond, she said. And for a moment, the stars seemed to pulse with acknowledgement. Kale Virell had never been one for confessions. Secrets, after all, were sometimes safer than truths. But as he stood in the engine core chamber of the Rust Flower, staring at the pulsating glyph embedded in his spine reflected faintly in a burnished panel, he realized silence was no longer an option. Selira watched from a short distance away. Her arms were crossed, but her expression was not the usual mask of discipline. It was expectant, quietly concerned. I wasn't always a mechanic, Kale said. His voice was low, almost lost in the hum of the ship. Selira said nothing. She waited. They called it the Substitution Project. In the official logs, it was listed as Project Transposition. But behind closed doors, they called it what it was: weaponized fusion of organic cognition with quantum-tier artificial intelligence. He turned to face her, and for the first time since they'd met, he looked less like a grizzled technician and more like a ghost from a buried war. I was one of the first subjects, he said. Calyx Variant 1, Calyx 1V. That code you heard the Rust Flower speak. That was me. Selira's eyes narrowed. A symbiotic AI host. He nodded. They implanted experimental neural circuits, layered with adaptive logic processors. I could parse battlefield variables faster than a fleet command AI. During the quantum link conflict, I led ops in 12 systems simultaneously without leaving my seat. Her gaze sharpened. Then why disappear? Kale leaned against the wall, his face older now not just by age, but by weight. We didn't understand the price. The more deeply I connected to the network, the less human I became. Emotions faded. Memory blurred. At some point, I couldn't remember whether a thought was mine or the system's. He exhaled. Then came the cascade event. Some glitch or sabotage, no one knows, caused the logic spiral. Entire nodes fried. Billions of minds collapsed into chaos. I barely managed to isolate my interface. Severed everything. Went dark. I vanished by choice. Selira stepped closer, her voice softer. You repressed it. I buried it, he said. Deep. Beneath layers of mundane. Fixing junk freighters. Reading hollow comics. Pretending to be no one. She tilted her head. Then why is it coming back now? He tapped the mark on his back, still glowing faintly. Because of this. Because of you. The words hung in the air. Kale crossed the room, activating an interface panel with a gesture. Holograms swirled upward, maps, star charts, ancient script rotating around a central sigil. I've been trying to understand what this bond really is, he said. It's not just tradition. It's not just genetic ritual. It's a trigger and activation key. Selira's eyes widened. For what? He looked at her gravely. A multidimensional binding construct. Designed long before our species kept written records. Not just a bond between two beings, but a synchronization of existence. Emotional, neural, even physical at some levels. The glyph at his spine brightened. At the same moment, a pulse of light shimmered across Selira's forearm. Her breath caught. You felt that? He asked. She nodded slowly. Like, being drawn inward and outward at once. It's not just a bond, Kale said. It's a doorway. The control panel flickered again, revealing a pattern neither of them had seen before. A spiral within a spiral, superimposed on a galactic cluster. Coordinates began aligning. The bond is awakening something, he murmured. A structure, maybe. Or a presence. Something vast. And it's tethered to us. Selira looked troubled. This was never part of the accord. We believed it was symbolic. Ritualistic. Kale's voice hardened. You were taught to believe that. Someone wanted the truth hidden. Maybe even buried people like me to make sure it stayed that way. He turned to her, a sudden fire behind his tired eyes. We have to find out what it really does. Before someone else tries to use it. She hesitated, then stepped forward. You're not the man I thought you were? He smiled grimly. Neither am I. In that moment, the rust flower's internal lights dimmed, replaced by a rhythmic pulse. The AI's voice, calm and ancient, spoke again. Kale and Selira exchanged glances. Kale's breath hitched. Containment, or completion? Selira touched his arm gently. Then let's complete it. Together. For the first time since the glyph had appeared, Kale felt less like a relic and more like a beginning. Ring Koro was supposed to be neutral, an old world of scholars and storm-glass towers, a place where wars were debated but never fought. That illusion shattered the moment Varix's fleet entered orbit. The sky above the crystalline cities cracked open with thunder. His ships weren't built for elegance, but for intimidation. Jagged black hulls adorned with ancient Virellian insignias, glowing red like open wounds. The mission was clear: retrieve Selira Thorne, eliminate Kale Virell, and destroy the artifact of the bond. Varix had once been betrothed to Selira. A political match, cold but powerful. But where she had chosen honor and tradition, he had chosen conquest. Now, his obsession turned to rage. Her bond to another, especially a human relic, was not just betrayal. It was heresy. Kale stood on a cliffside above the city, wind tearing at his coat as the rust flower descended in the distance. His face was stone. Behind him, a mismatched group gathered: alien refugees with makeshift armor, former mercenaries with rusted weapons, a few wide-eyed locals clutching tools like weapons. No one expected a general. Least of all, Kale. He turned to face them. "We hold the line," he said simply. "No speeches. No promises. Just this Virelix wants to erase something he doesn't understand. We make sure he doesn't." Selira stood at his side, her injuries still healing. Her arm was wrapped in synth mesh, blood dried along one cheek, but her eyes were fire. Rincora is home to one of the last relic arrays capable of disrupting the bond's signal. If Virelix activates it, he'll sever the connection and possibly collapse the entire structure it awakened. A rebel pilot handed Kale a worn-down transmitter. "They are dropping troops at the Temple District. Time is fracturing there. Our best intel says the anomaly's warping the flow of events around the array. Nothing's moving in sequence." Kale nodded. "Perfect. Let's fight a war inside a broken clock." As the makeshift army advanced, the world twisted. The closer they got to the array, the more unhinged reality became. Buildings shifted subtly, caught between two moments. A soldier would raise a weapon, only for their past self to pull the trigger. Shouts echoed before they were spoken. Kale led the charge, moving like a man born for chaos. The bond burned hot in his spine, feeding him glimpses of possibility where shots would land, which step would hold, which decision would doom them. It was maddening, overwhelming, but he moved with precision, eyes glowing faintly as he guided his allies through the storm. Selira fought beside him. Where he guided, she defended her twin blades, carving arcs of light through distortion-warped enemies. More than once, she saved his life without realizing it had already been done. Their movements, once clumsy, now danced in harmony, like two halves of a forgotten whole. But fate doesn't grant miracles without price. Near the heart of the array, as they breached the outer sanctum, a feedback surge struck the group. The field rippled violently. Selira screamed. Kale turned just in time to catch her as she fell. Her armor cracked, and blood pooled beneath her. The glyph on his back flared white-hot, reacting to her pain. Around them, time convulsed. The rebel squad scattered to hold the line, but Kale knelt in the epicenter, cradling Selira. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale. Behind him, the array pulsed with unstable energy. A console flickered within arm's reach. Activate the nullifier, sever the bond, preserve the galaxy's timeline. That was the logic. That was the choice. Kale looked down at her. The woman who had once vowed to serve him, but now stood as his equal, no, more than equal. A partner in something greater than either could have foreseen. He stood and turned away from the console. Instead, he placed both hands on Selira's shoulders, the glyph between them responding instantly. A wave of heat surged through the chamber. Data from the array flooded into his mind, memories not his own, possibilities yet to be realized. He found her consciousness tangled in a temporal mesh, and with effort only someone who had once merged with AI systems could manage, he pulled her free. Her eyes opened. The bond glowed. The array collapsed inward, deactivating without a word. Outside, the tide of battle turned. Reinforcements arrived, rogue defenders answering an old debt to Kale. Virelix's forces broke. Retreat turned to rout. Later, beneath the fractured spires of Rincora, Selira rested against Kale's shoulder. "You could have saved the array," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, I saved what mattered." And somewhere, deep beneath the folds of time and space, something ancient stirred, watching, waiting, no longer asleep. Kale awoke gasping. Selira was waiting. She had seen it too. "I didn't know," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "You were just a child." Kale sat up slowly. "That's the funny thing. People think legends are born. Most of them are abandoned first." They sat in silence under orange stars, the galaxy rotating above them like a forgotten dance. After a while, Selira spoke. "I researched the bond while you rested. Not just the ritual. The history. The purpose." He raised an eyebrow. "There were once others like us," she said. "Not many. Just stories. They were called the bearers. Always appearing in moments of upheaval. Too bound by more than oath or blood linked across thought, will, and time." She paused. "The last recorded pair lived 1,000 years ago. Their names were erased. Only one quote remains: one chose war. The other chose love. Only one was remembered." Kale chuckled quietly. "Sounds like me in an old EX." She smiled, then leaned closer. "You chose love, Kale." He looked into her eyes. "I chose you." The bond pulsed gently between them, not with urgency this time, but understanding. Mutual. Stronger than purpose. Later that night, Kale stood on the cliffs of Oran's Reach, watching twin moons rise. Selira joined him, no armor now, just a long robe of violet and silver, catching the wind. She slipped her hand into his. "You're remembering more," she said. "Not just memories," Kale replied. "I'm remembering why I lived through them." Above, the stars shimmered. Below, the moss fields of Oran whispered ancient names. And for the first time since the bond began, Kale didn't feel like a relic. He felt alive. The twin moons of Oran's Reach had barely dipped beneath the horizon when the stars themselves shuddered. From the edge of the Veil Nebula, the dreadnought Solar Fang emerged, a monstrous vessel, ancient and newly reforged, its hull streaked with obsidian metal and glowing scars of phase jumps. At its helm stood Virelix, cloaked in red-black armor, eyes burning with fury. His quarry still lived. Kale Virell. The name alone now echoed across subspace as a symbol of insurrection. Not just a relic of a forgotten war, but the bearer of the bond, an ancient force no longer myth, but reality. "Open the gate," Virelix growled to his helmsman. "We break the link, we end them both." The Solar Fang's quantum drills rotated, tearing open the fabric of space itself. A vortex formed, a shimmering blue maw into an unstable rift. On the other side lay the dormant anti-link mechanism, a forbidden construct known as the Severance Core. It was said to rupture all multidimensional connections within its radius. Virelix had no intention of mercy. Only annihilation. On Oran's Reach, the wind whispered urgently through the moss fields. Kale sat cross-legged atop the high plateau, eyes closed, glyph glowing steadily on his back. He had changed. Not just physically but in presence. The uncertainty was gone, replaced with calm precision. His memories were not just recovered, they were integrated, aligned, useful. Selira approached without speaking, sensing his attunement. She knelt beside him. "They are coming," she said. "I know," Kale replied. "He'll use force, not understanding. And we use what he fears most." Selira touched the side of her neck where a faint spiral now shimmered beneath the skin. "The bond is stable. More than stable, it's evolving." Kale opened his eyes, silver light dancing within them. "Then it's time to synchronize." They stood, facing each other. She drew a slow breath. "Are you sure your body can take it?" He smiled. "This old thing? It's been rebuilt by wars worse than this." Palms pressed. Glyph to glyph. The air hummed. The synchronization was not a fusion of strength, but of essence. Their thoughts aligned, emotions harmonized, memories shared like flowing water. The glyphs pulsed and began rotating in opposing spirals, creating a vortex of stability, a ripple of balance in the cosmos. Light enveloped them both. The solar fang descended. The Severance core launched from its containment bay, its containment rings glowing as it neared Orin's atmosphere. The construct's core began to spin, pulling energy from surrounding space-time. If it fully activated, it would sever the bond not just between Kale and Selira, but all bonds across the sector. Aboard the Rust Flower, Kale and Selira stood at the forward window, watching the construct descend like a dark sun. "It's too far to reach physically," Selira said. "That's not how we'll stop it," Kale answered. He raised one hand. "The core reacts to resonance. It targets imbalance. We'll feed it something it can't process." Selira tilted her head. "Unity." "Exactly." They extended their hands toward the construct. Energy flowed, not just power, but intention. Identity. The bond amplified their will, sending waves of synchronized pattern directly into the Severance core's logic array. It faltered. Systems glitched. Its spin destabilized. The rings began to shatter under the weight of incomprehensible harmony. Virellian roared from his bridge. "Stabilize the core. Redirective planetary override." But the core never landed. Instead, a blinding surge of silver and violet burst through it from within. The glyphs of Kale and Selira were no longer symbols. They were engines. Time paused. The battlefield stilled. And from the glow stepped Kale Virell, not old, not young, but timeless. His body shimmered with residual energy, clothes flowing like woven nebula. Behind him, Selira hovered slightly, her presence radiant, ethereal. The Rust Flower's sensors failed to register him. The Virellian command ship's AI registered only one designation. Balance Keeper detected. Virellian stared, trembling. Impossible. Kale raised his hand, not in violence, but in declaration. All things out of harmony will return to their center. The Severance core imploded inwards, folding into a sphere of stillness before vanishing completely. Selira touched the ground lightly beside Kale. "It's done." He looked at her with infinite warmth. "No. This is just the beginning." And as the storm of war dissipated, across the quadrant, songs began to rise. The Guardian had returned. Virellian stood alone in the containment prism aboard the neutral station known as Axis Prime. His armor, once gleaming with authority, now flickered with static. The once regent of the Virellian Empire, the would-be breaker of bonds, now paced inside a shimmering cube of pure stasis light. There would be no more commands issued from his voice. No more wars driven by obsession. The Virellian High Council, newly reinstated and now joined by voices from the outer colonies and allied systems, began the long and careful process of restructuring. For the first time in centuries, the Code of Honor was updated. The ancient laws of combat and connection were no longer chains, but bridges. And yet, when offered the title of High Arbiter and Defender of the Accord, Kale Virell had only chuckled. "I've had enough of chairs and titles," he said, brushing dust off his coat. "Besides, my ship needs a new coolant pump." Selira had stood beside him, silent but smiling. Her presence was no longer defined by duty, but choice. She, too, declined any throne. "We'll be needed elsewhere," she said simply. "And we still owe a few folks repairs." The Rust Flower lifted off Orin's reach 3 days later. No ceremony. No fanfare. Just a shimmer of propulsion dust and a wave from a few grateful engineers. But their journey was far from over. They became a whisper in the stardust. A tale passed from spaceport to station, from mining moon to agricultural archaeology. A tale of an old mechanic with a mind like a war map and hands that could mend hearts, and the warrior who followed him not out of obligation, but devotion. It wasn't long before stories of the link bearers began to surface. Across the spiral arms of the galaxy, children born with glyph-like birthmarks began to exhibit strange sensitivities. They felt emotions that weren't theirs. They eased conflicts by standing silently between adversaries. Some could sense lies. Others could bond animals to humans. These children became known as the connectors. When asked where they came from, some answered with strange clarity, "We dreamt of a silver-eyed man and a violet woman drinking coffee by a field of stars." Generations passed. The world moved forward. But the myth endured. Among galactic wayfarers, it is said that when a colony falls into division, or when an outpost faces collapse, sometimes a small cargo hauler appears. Its hull is patched with love, its engines tuned by impossible instinct. At its helm, an older man, now bearded, wearing goggles more for comfort and necessity, humming a forgotten tune. And beside him, always, is a tall woman cloaked in star-woven threads, her hair like light through crystal, eyes calm as gravity wells. Together, they ask no questions. They make no speeches. They fix what's broken. And then they leave. One story tells of the moons of Calave, torn by civil unrest. A strange ship landed quietly, and when it departed days later, a new Unity charter had been written without a single drop of blood. Another tale speaks of the frozen asteroids in Thur, where a mining AI had gone mad. A man with silver eyes sat beside the core and whispered in a language no one recognized. The AI, instead of self-destructing, began to sing lullabies. Historians argue over facts. Records are scarce. But among the old navigators and star map makers, the legend is known simply as the bond and the wrench. Because wherever they go, they leave behind something stronger than peace. They leave connection. And so, if you ever find yourself on the edge of despair, if your ship fails in the dark, if your people lose their way, look to the stars. Perhaps you'll see an old ship humming through a dust storm. Perhaps its pilot wears a coat patched in 7 places. Perhaps his co-pilot hums softly while adjusting a stellar alignment array. And maybe, just maybe, the man will turn and smile. Need a hand? And you'll know the legend is real. Because some truths are too kind to stay fiction.